Who are your groups of stakeholders that you have in your organizations? Let's start to give them some names and some categories. Who would you describe as your stakeholders? So, as you're thinking about that, what I'd like to come back to is some of the opportunities we have to customize. So, I see the board, the community, public, patrons, our residents, our peers, absolutely, some of our affiliates, most definitely. And being able to name our stakeholders gives us a really great starting point for this conversation on influence. Contractors, right? We have other departments in the organization, the city council, local businesses. All of these are the folks that we would consider to be our stakeholders. One of the groups that is interesting to me that is missing from this list is our employees, right? Our employees are also our stakeholders. They're their own stakeholder group. So we think of stakeholders in two buckets. We think of them in terms of our internal stakeholders, right? We have our employees, our executives. You might consider your board to be internal as well. But then you also have your external stakeholders. You have the residents, the suppliers, the partners, even some organizations outside of your own that you partner with, those other departments or organizations. Lainey did mention staff. Yes, those are opportunities for us to really think about dividing our stakeholder groups into these two buckets. And I'm curious, why do you think it's important for us to be able to name our groups of stakeholders? What are some of the benefits that you think we gain from being able to name our stakeholders and divide them up in these different buckets? The internal and external stakeholder buckets give us a chance to think about how much information we're sharing, right? Internally, we might choose to share more, externally, maybe less. And so Jody has brought in our focused marketing, right? So being able to identify those stakeholder groups, we can focus our marketing efforts. We can definitely hone in on our messaging. We can understand how our decisions are impacting them. It gives us that awareness, developing the messaging for the needs that we have. So as we're thinking about these groups, we have the opportunity to build those communication methodologies. We have the opportunity also to ensure that we have alignment of those goals. We have the opportunity to pull those groups in for input, to help us build things. When we get feedback from our stakeholders, we can listen to that feedback. We all know that we can't necessarily act on everything that we get, but when you're a stakeholder and you feel as if you have been heard, and even if the response is, we can't do anything about that right now, I'm sorry, we can't address that at the moment, there is just this feeling that you've at least been understood. And for stakeholders and for building influence, it's very important that even if the answer is no, you're still going to need to go to that group at some point, and you're still going to need to influence them. Delivering that message in such a way that is respectful and ensures that you've heard them is really important. The other thing that this does is it gives us the opportunity to build trust. All of the things that you're identifying here really do help us build trust with a group of stakeholders. It gives us the opportunity to think about them perhaps in a different way than we've thought about them previously. It gives us a chance for us to think about what they might need from us. When we start to think about it that way, we can start to build that foundation for influence and help guide some of those conversations. Influence isn't necessarily about getting someone to agree with you all of the time. Influence is about getting someone to see something from a different perspective and hopefully getting them to align with your goals and your vision and where you want to go. The ability for us to identify those stakeholders also helps us think about where we can put our resources. Where should we be putting our time and energy? Where should we be putting the sparse budgets that we all seem to have? We need to identify the different needs that our stakeholders have. They're going to need customized solutions. They're going to need that enhanced collaboration that Heather mentioned. We're going to need an opportunity to have improved decision-making conversations. While we're thinking about this, I'd love for you to jot down a particular group of stakeholders that you're finding particularly challenging. If you want to keep it to yourself and just make a note, we're going to continue to come back to that group of stakeholders as we move through the rest of our time together. When we think about this and we recognize that there are extremely different needs that each of these groups have, if you really take a breath and pause, it can feel really overwhelming. So if you're just thinking about it this way for the very first time, it can seem like you're drinking from the fire hose of, wait a minute, every single stakeholder group needs its own method of communication. It's going to need their own method of messaging. They're going to need their own outcomes. So these are the types of situations where we want to see what we can standardize. What are the things that are common for all groups of stakeholders? And then where do those differences lie? So Louisa and Kathy, Bree and Louisa, again, dropped in some stakeholders that it sounds like they might be having some challenging times with. Thank you very much for sharing that. Again, I just want you to make sure that you've got something in mind as we continue to go through these particular conversations. The other reason that identifying stakeholders for influence purposes is so important is it allows us to prioritize. Not every single group of stakeholders needs the same amount of attention for each particular situation. And so when we're thinking about it, being able to determine what impact things will have on a particular group will help us prioritize how much time and effort we potentially spend with one particular group of stakeholders. So as we're thinking about this, when we get together and we start to think about all of these different concepts around stakeholders, there's an activity that I would encourage you to do if it would stay on the slide. There we go. Stakeholder mapping. This gives us the opportunity to identify who your stakeholders are, what are their needs and their interests and their expectations, what is their level of influence and power, right? So this was mentioned earlier in the comments. What is their level of support or opposition? So this might be in regards to a specific initiative. It might be in regards to a specific budget proposal or a specific change that you want to make. And then what communication strategies are needed? And when we think about communication strategies, it's not even necessarily only the what are we going to communicate. We also want to think about how are we going to communicate. So when we did this session last week, Jody brought up a really good point around social media and talking about how social media and the word influence have come together in this social media influencer category. And so when you're thinking about communication, even you have the opportunity to think about how you're currently leveraging your marketing opportunities, your social media opportunities, your ability to interact with different members of the public and different members of your stakeholder groups. And if you can do something like this stakeholder mapping exercise for your largest groups of stakeholders, it can give you a consistent way to look at that particular group of people. So if you're looking at a group of stakeholders and you're saying, okay, who are they? What are their main interests and expectations? And this might be something that needs to be refreshed on a annual or biannual basis. What is their level of influence or power? This is something that stays relatively consistent with a particular group of stakeholders. What communication strategies work best? The other thing that is interesting to document is what have our recent wins been with a group of stakeholders? When things have gone well, what have those things been and what has been done? And that gives you potentially a roadmap to follow in the future as well. So if you can take the time and work with the team to identify some of these characteristics about these stakeholders, it gives you a starting point when you start to think about how you want to influence. When you have the opportunity to start to lay the groundwork for something or start to collaborate on something, having this profile almost gives you the opportunity to really be proactive and think about how you want to present information, how you want to share information, what type of input and feedback you want to ask